He's the author of 2 monographs, one forthcoming from Cambridge University Press next year, titled The Brothers Grimm and the Making of German Nationalism. Another one appeared in 2014 from Northwestern University Press, titled Sociability and Its Enemies, German Political Theory After 1945. That book examines theory about the public sphere in the early years of the Federal Republic of Germany, when the idea of sociability, that is Geselligkeit, was so important. He ranges over readings of the journal Die Wandlung, published in Heidelberg between November 1945 and autumn 1949, that looked towards a change and renewal for Germans, both in the Western and Soviet occupation zones, following the 12 years of Nazis. Karl Jaspers and Dolf Sternberger organized contributions to that journal from such figures as Hannah Arendt, T.S. Eliot, Kaschnitz, Storz, Susskind. The attempt here was to find ways through the concept of sociability, he tells us, to move past the Third Reich's focus on such ideas as folk, party, leader, and the state, and move to change the field of the political through this concept of sociability. The book includes readings of the post-war writing of Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt that was largely shared in private meetings and venues, theorist of technology as we think of him now, and in this context, a theorist of the concept of critique itself, Reinhard Koselleck, shedding light on his early politics, political theorists Hannah Arendt and Jürgen Habermas. And while Arendt was clearly a critic of some version of bourgeois sociability, Jakob shows how Habermas's early work from 1962, quote, looks somewhat like an elaborate and more academic version of an already established idea of bourgeois sociability as a transitional and educational practice for Germans on a path to a more deliberative polity, end quote. This insightful study in intellectual history and the early points of critical theory is expanded in his studies of Brecht and Lukács, Adorno and Benjamin, for example. In a recent article published in New German Critique, he considers Lukács's ideas concerning hate and hatred, and points out that whereas today there is such a great deal of anxiety about hatred in the form of hate speech, hate crimes, for example, he shows how Lukács wanted to mobilize the affect of hate for revolutionary ends. He understood, Jakob shows us in that article how Lukács understood that hatred could function as an anti-capitalist affect, equipping an author with a set of traits, certainty, lucidity, endurance, and pitilessness, that are useful for exposing and destroying a fundamentally criminal socio-economic system, as he puts it. Now, Jakob is associate professor in German here, and his talk today is titled Schopenhauer's Politics. Thanks very much for joining us, and over to Jakob.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation and for this kind and very extensive introduction. I've been familiarizing myself with works I wrote a long time ago. So I'm just going to start by giving you a background for this talk. So I wrote a book on the Brothers Grimm that is coming out in 2022. The Brothers Grimm are history's, two most famous folktale collectors, maybe grammarians too. And in this book, I argue that their scholarship was animated by a nationalist vision. They thought that they, as scholars, could define national identity, delineate national borders, adjudicate territorial disputes, and even counsel kings and regimes. And they represented, I claim, a new figure, not a philosopher king, but a philologist king. Every king needed a philologist at the court. So after finishing this book, I wanted to look at this age, the early 19th century, this age of emerging ideologies from a different angle. And I chose Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer belonged to the same generation as the Grimms, and he experienced the same upheavals, wars, revolutions, territorial reconfigurations. We had a very different background and formed very different political commitments, and they were non-nationalists or anti-nationalists. So this is a talk about Schopenhauer. It's kind of a portrait of Schopenhauer in his time and his relationship to ideologies. And I will begin this portrait with a scene from his youth. So that's Schopenhauer as a young man, and this is the port that he visited when he was 15 years old. So in the spring of 1803, the 15-year-old Arthur Schopenhauer visited a place of abject misery, a kind of gigantic assembly of pain, a hell on earth. You don't see it here, but it's behind the scenes. This was a shipbuilding yard in the French port of Toulon with 6,000 prisoners, criminals condemned to years and decades of hard labor, often chained to one another or chained to benches. The inmates endured what the teenage Schopenhauer called a punishment worse than death. And in his account of the visit, he wrote of his horror at the sight of his joyless, hopeless, undignified existence. Everything he saw filled him with dread. Without a vocabulary for his experience, he used the word schrecklich, horrifying, 4 times in one paragraph. His mother and travel companion Johanna Schopenhauer described the scene in greater detail and with greater eloquence, but in the same mood. Among hundreds of men with rattling chains, she noted many with wildly contorted faces that looked like the masks of the devil, or others who had been reduced to dull animality, and a few letting out furious screams and deranged laughs. The arsenal in Toulon, she concluded, was a place similar to hell. So this visit to a naval site that took place on a Schopenhauer family tour of Europe. Schopenhauer and his parents were visiting the coast of France, spent some time in this port, and then they entered the French Navy arsenal where convicts were building ships as part of the Napoleonic War effort. And both Johanna and Arthur Schopenhauer kept travel diaries. And Johanna would later turn her journal into a travel book. That's her and that's her book. A trip to southern France, one of the first books she published in her successful writing career. During her lifetime, she really was the most famous Schopenhauer, with a series of popular novels in the 1820s. The teenage Arthur was not an aspiring author. As a 15-year-old, he kept a journal because he had been instructed to keep a journal, to write daily in order to perfect his handwriting. His father had invited him to this grand tour only if he agreed to apprentice with a wholesale merchant after the end of the trip. And the tour of Holland, England, France, and parts of Germany were just steps in Schopenhauer's preparation to inherit his father's trade. The businessman needed proficiency in modern languages, English and French, international experience, and sober handwriting. So after his death in 1805, Schopenhauer would veer away from the planned career, end his merchant apprenticeship, and begin preparatory studies for a university education meant to pave the way towards a different future. A little more than a decade after, in 1818, Schopenhauer, now in his mid-20s, finished The World as Will and Representation, a book that would later make him famous as the philosopher of suffering. This is a quote: "If suffering is not the closest and most immediate goal of our life," he wrote, "then our existence is the most inexpedient thing in the world." But according to Schopenhauer himself, it was his teenage experiences, rather than his later philosophical training, that made him see that pain was so ubiquitous, inevitable, and overwhelming that the obvious purpose of life must be suffering. In notes from the year 1832, as cholera swept Berlin and Schopenhauer relocated to Frankfurt, he wrote that the insight into the wretchedness of life gripped him before he had acquired any learned schooling. And betraying his grandiosity a bit, Schopenhauer added that it was his confrontation with pervasive suffering in his youth that had persuaded him of this fact. Like the young Buddha, whose teachings were shaped by early encounters with sickness, old age, pain, and death. Okay, so Schopenhauer sees himself as a follower of Buddha in some sense. So before reaching maturity, Schopenhauer had realized that the world could not possibly be the creation of a benevolent being, but must be the work of a devil. He was, from very early on, an observer of pain in the world, and he drew radically pessimistic conclusions from his observations. He did not, however, draw political conclusions. The spectacle of thousands of poorly treated prisoners horrified the young Schopenhauer, but it didn't provoke in him an explicit political judgment. It was a scene of mass suffering, but it wasn't a scene of oppression or coercion or injustice. We can't quite attribute this lack of political curiosity to youth and inexperience. In a publication released almost 5 decades after his European trip, Schopenhauer likened society as a whole to a penitentiary full of criminals, to illustrate the fallen condition of humankind. All human beings are fellow sufferers, he said, and fellow prisoners. He still made no distinction between guards and inmates, ruler and ruled, oppressor or oppressed. And in the same bundle of remarks, he also bluntly stated, the world is simply hell, and that human beings torture each other and are being tortured by each other. But who exactly did what to whom, for what reason, that was a question he didn't linger on. So Schopenhauer focused on the problem of human suffering, but not the precise causes of that human suffering, maybe not the distribution of that suffering. He very rarely systematically wrote about the possibility of constructed and maintained permanent hierarchies of unequal suffering, and did not explore means to address human suffering on a mass scale. For him, distress was ultimately metaphysically rooted, not really susceptible to improvement. When one of Schopenhauer's disciples suggested in a conversation that some human sensitivity to brute physical pain could be softened through anesthesia and other advances in medicine in the early 19th century, Schopenhauer referred to the inexhaustible news reports about homicide, bloody fights, shipwrecks, and other horrendous accidents, which to him proved on a daily basis that suffering would never end. Facing the prospect of alleviating the human condition, the premier metaphysician of suffering revealed himself to be kind of an average modern media consumer, overwhelmed by a steady stream of bad news. So this is a picture of the London Times, and he read them almost daily. It was a habit I think he took over from his father. The scholars have generally agreed that Schopenhauer made no meaningful contribution to political thought. A recent short biography of Schopenhauer in English states that he was singularly uninterested in political philosophy. An introduction to a companion to his philosophy similarly speaks of the brazenly ahistorical and apolitical cast of Schopenhauer's thought. Even an entry on Schopenhauer in an encyclopedia of political thought begins with the admission that Schopenhauer had relatively little concern for political philosophy, just as he was largely indifferent to the politics of his day. And this judgment, I should say, has a long tradition. In the first Schopenhauer biographies from the early 1860s, his followers bickered about the correct image of the philosopher, but all agreed that he had little to nothing to say about politics. And the image of the apolitical Schopenhauer was also shared across disparate ideological traditions, with different, even conflicting interpretations and conceptions of politics. So the Marxist critic Lukács categorized Schopenhauer's pessimism as an anti-political strategy. The purpose of Schopenhauer's philosophy was precisely to corrode the public's faith in the efficacy of political action. Schopenhauer, Lukács argued, meant to devalue society and history in order to consolidate the status quo. He was an apologist for the capitalist bourgeois society, but in a kind of oblique fashion. Against the background of such an overwhelming consensus on the near absence of political philosophy in Schopenhauer's work, the attempt today by me to produce a revisionist account seems absurdly contrarian. Yet I think such an account could be of interest. Schopenhauer was politically out of step with his own period, and even appeared as a willfully anachronistic figure who chose to speak about politics in terms introduced by 17th century thinkers, especially the English political theories Thomas Hobbes and the Spanish theories of prudence, Baltasar Gracián. In an age of rival ideological movements, liberalism, conservatism, socialism, communism, Schopenhauer remained intentionally minimalist and wrote about the role of the state and political action exclusively from the viewpoint of a technician of order, On the macro level, Schopenhauer leaned on Hobbes and deemed the state a contractually based institution for mutual protection, a mere device and nothing beyond it. And on the micro level, Schopenhauer leaned on Gracian and identified political action with prudent action, defined as cool and poker-faced manipulation of others for the achievement of defined personal ends. In the context of the rhetoric of the time, with its visions of justified revolution, perpetual peace, that's Kant, communities of love, that's the Romanticist, the state as an ethical whole, that's Hegel, society as an egalitarian collaboration, that's Marx. Schopenhauer's comments on politics were deflationary. In the realm of politics, Schopenhauer indicated, with deliberate austerity, not much could be achieved. No emancipation, unification, reconciliation, redemption. But his distance to the grand political projects of his time also allowed him to catch problems somewhat marginal in his surroundings that maybe have gained greater salience in ours. Dismissive of a human society that considers itself ethical and yet treats animals poorly, he pioneered philosophical defense of animal welfare. A human being who is cruel to animals, he stated simply, cannot be a good human being. Repelled by displays of patriotic enthusiasm, he never showed any interest in the founding of a specifically national state, and he thought nationalism loathsome. That's the great political project of the 19th century, the consolidation of national states, nation states. Without connection to the Christian church and alienated by official theology, he found solace in philosophical confirmation in tracts of Hinduism and Buddhism, and consciously contested and departed from the notion of Western supremacy in matters of religion and thought. And he also noted a problematic bias against non-human animals in Western theology. And finally, he denied that modern revolutionary republicanism constituted an advance over ancient republics or even traditional European royal regimes of his own epoch. And he saw North American slavery as a telling symptom of a dubious system rather than an aberration. The cruelty of enslavement was to Schopenhauer not a betrayal of modern republican principles, but a fairly typical manifestation of a republican regime, because the removal of the one royal sovereign, he thought, placed above everyone else, would lead to the proliferation of petty lords and oppressors rather than perfect egalitarianism. In this case, he did confront hierarchy or permanent exploitation and subordination, but he did so in the context of a pro-monarchist argument. So Schopenhauer stood for a compassion with suffering, for a sensitivity to suffering so radical that he would render the borders and divisions between individuals, cultures, populations, and even species more porous. This is a scene from a courtroom where someone was accused of animal cruelty. Right? It was an early court case against animal cruelty, and Schopenhauer was very interested in these kinds of cases and ideas. Convinced of the centrality of pain to an account of human existence, Schopenhauer noticed pain where others ignored it. Yet he understood his stance as a moral rather than political commitment. And it was coupled with a complete disinterest in causes deemed progressive at his time, such as democratic participation, constitutionalism, proletarian mobilization, or really any form of collective activism. From a contemporary point of view, then, Schopenhauer might seem both prescient and reactionary. So Schopenhauer was used to finding himself in between camps or on the outside of cliques and parties. He was neither a revolutionary nor a conservative, neither a defender of the Christian faith nor an atheist radical. And he never showed support for any of the early 19th century's new political movements, such as fraternal nationalism, Hegelian statism, or early communism. Born in 1788, Schopenhauer was, to begin with, too young to experience directly the political shocks of the transatlantic revolutionary era. Living in the free port city of Danzig as members of the merchant class with Republican leanings, Schopenhauer's parents were stirred by news of the French Revolution, pictured here, and felt hope for a new world, but then alienated by reports about the regime of terror that followed. But Schopenhauer was also born after the first communitarian and romanticist responses to the revolutionary era. So he was not a German follower of the British politician and philosopher Edmund Burke. He showed no consistent preference for the blessings of evolutionary change, reliance on tradition, or the integrity of organic communities. Schopenhauer's resistance to ideologies of his day became apparent once he entered adulthood. Every decade of his life, from his youth in the 1810s, he encountered and he rejected a new set of political beliefs carried by a new emerging social or professional group. To begin with, Schopenhauer's indifference to the national cause stands out among his generational peers. Shaped by the Napoleonic invasion of German lands since 1806, many intellectuals in Schopenhauer's age, they embraced the nationalist creed of ethnically and linguistically defined self-government, supported by a revival of native German culture. Here you see kind of the German nationalists fighting the war against Napoleon. The brothers Grimm, for instance, and I wrote this book on them, they were roughly the same age as Schopenhauer, and they spent their adult lives assembling fragments of an ancient German culture meant to ground the claim to national political autonomy. Schopenhauer, by contrast, was always dismissive of the significance of nationhood. Good authors, he claimed, do not belong to any specific nation, should not aspire to mere national acclaim, and a genius in any field is always an exception in rather than a representative of a national population. Only unremarkable people like to boast about the accomplishments of their nations, he thought. He also said, more bluntly, that the majority of people were simply idiots who lived in perpetual ignorance, and that idiocy was a German national trait. He was basically ashamed of being German. Schopenhauer then stood for an anti-egalitarian, even kind of contemptuously elitist anti-nationalism. He felt no obligation to acknowledge a special bond with compatriots, because to him, he shared nothing with them. This position contrasted with that of many liberal contemporaries in the early 19th century, for whom nation states would be the frame for a more popular, broader political participation. Schopenhauer saw no virtue in this. So that was the 1810s, right? He didn't want to fight Napoleon, he didn't sign up, he didn't volunteer for any kind of military effort, and people remember that and will criticize him for it later. Now, the 1820s, another decade, saw the spread of another belief system among intellectual academic youth, and this time it had a definite source, Hegel. In his political philosophy, Hegel rejected the passionate fraternalism of the nation as the primary political mode of integration, and argued that emotional ties or spontaneous solidarity could never replace the rational architectonic of the state. Individuals, Hegel's taught, could come to recognize their interdependence and their unity, but then as citizens acting within the complex structure of modern institutions. The state, with its legal rights and duties, facilitated the autonomous agency of individuals, and it should be recognized as their proper role. Schopenhauer became well acquainted with this Hegelian position. He lived in Berlin at the time. He also tried to get a foothold in the university. He knew this very well. And he also identified Hegel's audience. This was the philosophy of a whole social universe of barristers, lawyers, doctors, candidates, and teachers, he said, the educated professional classes in modern society. As a failed academic, Schopenhauer was effectively barred from entry into this social class over the course of the 1820s, and he dismissed Hegelian statism. To him, the state was not the source of meaningful social membership. It was not the medium of a genuine reconciliation of all particular wills. It was something more modest, a device to quell unrest and to discipline the anarchic tendencies of egoistic individuals, but nothing beyond that. In Schopenhauer's eyes, Hegelian state philosophy simply glorified boring labor in large state bureaucracies, which is exactly why professional Prussian circles, all the barristers, doctors, lawyers so eagerly adopted it. Here you see Hegel, and then kind of a caricature of the Philistine, the person who carried and sustained Hegelianism in Schopenhauer's eyes. In the 1830s, now another decade, after Hegel's death, Hegelianism splintered into factions. Having moved away from Berlin and settled in Frankfurt, Schopenhauer did not directly participate in these debates, and he wouldn't have fit in any of the camps. The central arguments concerned the role of religion vis-a-vis philosophy, but they also concerned the state. After Hegel's death, loyal Hegelians continued to argue for the ultimate identity of religion and philosophy. whereas radical young Hegelians such as Ludwig Feuerbach questioned the convergence and presented religion as a form of collective self-alienation, in which human attributes were projected onto an imagined divine being to which humans must subject themselves. So the aim of this new critical philosophy, this young Hegelian philosophy, was to overcome this self-separation and help establish an entirely secular society. Now, Schopenhauer was aware of the writings of young Hegelians, and he was also aware of the conservative preference for religious orthodoxy. And then he took a position that would have satisfied no one. He appreciated the young Hegelian critique of Christianity as a bundle of myths and considered religion as a kind of popular metaphysics, with stories and narratives and fables designed for the great majority of people, unqualified to philosophize. You'll remember, he thinks most people are ignorant. But he did not demand a de-Christianization of the state. Instead, he argued that every political regime needs to use religion as an instrument of control and pacification for the sake of stability and order. So he was neither an authentically pious regime loyalist nor a radical secularist. As usual, he cared only about engineering stability. In the 1840s, finally, the most radical of the young Hegelians, excluded from academic careers, entered the public sphere, the wider public sphere, as champions of the exploited and the disenfranchised. The decade, the 1840s, saw a growing stream of socialist poems, editorials, pamphlets, manifestos. Among them, of course, the 1848 Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. That's young Karl Marx, and that's the manifesto. Both were about 2-3 decades younger than Schopenhauer. In his cryptic comments on left-wing radicalism, Schopenhauer considered socialism's focus on material needs a kind of exclusive preoccupation with primal physicality, and so he labeled socialism bestialism. But he also viewed the radical socialists as Hegelians, who had absorbed Hegel's philosophy, but exited the space of respectable institutions and now had turned into what he called marauders. According to Schopenhauer, these marauding Hegelians still sustained Hegelian belief in a perfected ethical order of independence and collaboration, but they were no longer attached to the monarchical state. And instead, they envisioned a post-revolutionary solidaristic future of collective ownership and egalitarianism. For Schopenhauer, the underlying belief in spontaneous and uncoerced cooperation was simply delusional. The only alternative to constant deterrence by a state monopoly was the monopoly of violence was anarchy. As fighting on the streets broke out in European and German cities in 1848, Schopenhauer became very worried, feeling that the entire legal order was under threat, and with it his inherited property. And this is a story that is always told, but he did dedicate funds in his will for the families of Prussian soldiers who had been wounded or killed in the attempt to restore law and order. So he sides here with the forces of law and order and the Prussian war. So this decade by decade overview of Schopenhauer's kind of serial repudiation of ideologies leaves us with a picture of a philosopher consistently committed to a very thin conception of politics, one focused on stability and nothing more. Without ties to any actual royal regime, he didn't work in the government or anything, any organized conservative interest, wasn't a member of any club or anything. Schopenhauer was nonetheless against democratic reforms, national unification, and plebeian revolution. He was an advocate of compassion, but an anti-socialist one. He was a cultural cosmopolitan, but a reactionary one. He was a critic of nationalism, but a supercilious one. Politically speaking, he considered the population to be nothing more than an aggregate of egoistic individuals whose tendencies toward violence must be curbed by a punitive state. He did not embrace the idea of an emerging collective subject, a nation, a race, or a class, whose struggle and eventual triumph would decide the fate of humanity. History was not the medium of progress towards a condition of universal freedom, perfect justice, non-fragmented collectivism, a proper human consciousness of the divine. Instead, history was a continuous dreary spectacle of conflict and war, which throughout the centuries enacted the identical problem of ceaselessly willing and desiring individuals inevitably colliding with one another. The endless striving that led to endless suffering could be distilled but then only on an individual basis, through an ascetic negation of the will. For Schopenhauer, redemption was possible for some, but it was always an individually focused practice, not a collective project. Politics was mitigatory rather than salvific. It was always an attempt to keep chaos at bay under perennially non-ideal conditions. So to understand Schopenhauer's contrarian political minimalism in an age of grand ideological aspirations, it's helpful to consider his social background and his career, or rather his non-career. Schopenhauer's background was more comfortable and more worldly than the representative German philosopher, as the family trip to France in 1803 suggested. Schopenhauer's father was a merchant who left his wife and children a solid inheritance after his passing, and the cultural image, that's Schopenhauer's father to the right from you. Schopenhauer's mother then moved to the luminary dense town of Weimar, where she began organizing a salon that served as a site of artful sociability, anchored by the regular presence of the great Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. So Schopenhauer's parents represented two high bourgeois activities: international commerce and enjoyable light conversation. Schopenhauer was very familiar with both these modes. So not unsurprisingly, Schopenhauer's identity was fairly bourgeois. This is his birthright. He could feel sympathy for families in abject poverty, and he could deplore how the desire for consumer commodities condemned large numbers of people to labor by exploitative, profit-seeking manufacturers. But for him, the great mass of the population could turn into a dangerous rabble, and the core function of the state was the protection of the property in society, in which the majority had next to nothing. So if Schopenhauer looked to the poor with political anxiety, he approached the aristocracy with resentment. He considered the contemporary nobility stuck in a feudal caste of honor that a comprehensive state system of law enforcement had made redundant. The nobility should never be allowed to indulge in any of their obsolete behaviors, he thought, such as the absurd sensitivity to slights that require dueling with mortal outcomes. The nobility, too, Schopenhauer thought, tended toward lawlessness. So without attraction to other groups in society, Schopenhauer nonetheless discontinued his own family's tradition. The break with the mother is very easy to identify. The young Schopenhauer proved a morose presence in his mother's salon, and after increasingly acrimonious family quarrels, he left Weimar for good. After 1814, he was still a young man, he never saw his mother again, and his writings contained a fully worked out critical philosophy of sociability, which explains that the pervasive need for entertaining sociability is necessarily empty and false and even damaging to exceptional minds. It's basically kind of a wrench against his mother in philosophical form. The pessimist Schopenhauer was also partly a misanthrope. Existence was agony, and other people were the source of most of his trouble or his trouble. The break with the father was less dramatic, but it was a break nonetheless. In his writings, Schopenhauer often singled out business people for praise. In a social world of false nobility, where people hunted for advantage and wealth under the cover of seeking truth and helping others, profit-oriented merchants were at least honest about their motifs. So used to decades, so he has nice things to say about Kaufleute, basically business people. And used to decades of neglect, Schopenhauer was also proud to learn that his philosophy had been discussed in the English Commercial and Industrial Weekly, The Economist, it's the same Economist we have today, in 1853. He didn't read the review because the review said that Schopenhauer was not much worth notice, would not have much effect outside of Germany, where he was also not popular. But for all his goodwill toward business, Schopenhauer decided not to engage in it. In a draft of a dedication written to his father's memory, he praised his father's bourgeois thrift, which had left him enough savings to pursue a life of contemplation and philosophy. And Schopenhauer even celebrated his father for being a proud Republican who would never have wanted his son to depend on government institutions and ministerial favor. But he still considered, Schopenhauer still considered a life of business a distraction an actual republicanism far too anarchic and violent. His grateful dedication to his father was ultimately not a celebration of republicanism, it was a celebration of the trust fund that he had left his son. So Schopenhauer never really found a permanent place in another social niche. He wrote a dissertation and acquired the credentials for an academic career, but he could never successfully launch one. He did not apply for government work, and with a degree in philosophy, he didn't join any of the professions. By his own admission, Schopenhauer never acquired what typically belonged to a respectable member of society. He never climbed an institutional hierarchy, he never bought a home, he never started a family. He never exercised a profession, occupied no office, ran no company, joined no association, supported no party. Throughout his adult life, he lived off his inheritance for decades, and his defined identity as a great philosopher in the tradition of Plato and Kant was joined for him, in his mind, with a crucial enabling condition, namely his detached social existence as a rentier. So basically, he felt that property is a precondition for genuine independence, and independence, economic, social independence, is the genuine precondition for philosophy, not to have to bow to anyone, not to have to compromise, and the university system, which was crowded by Hegelians, was one gigantic system of conformism. So against this background, it is perhaps unsurprising that Schopenhauer viewed society atomistically as a collection of individuals alienated from one another and posing a threat to each other's security and safety. There were for Schopenhauer only individuals and the means they needed for their long-term subsistence, and that had to be protected by states. At the same time, his distance from all these collectives of the period, the nations and the classes, the professional groups, the organizations and the parties, might have allowed him to see suffering at the edges of what the 19th century considered legitimate political causes. In response to ubiquitous pain, he formulated a very positive account of compassion as de-individuation. To suffer with others, he thought, was to feel their pain as your own, even to break down the barrier between apparently contoured beings, and ultimately to grasp the underlying metaphysical identity of all. Compassion was a form of practical mysticism, where everyone can emerge, but the plurality was smoothed out. Schopenhauer thus oscillated between a stubborn political individualism and a moral vision of radical de-differentiation, between a commitment to law and order designed to guard the safety of the rentier and yearning for the dissolution of all individuality. Schopenhauer held that politically we have nothing in common, but that we are metaphysically one and the same. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jakob. Well, we're now open for questions. For those of you who are on Zoom, you can put your questions in the Q&A, and I will communicate them to the room. And those of you who are in the room can just put your hands up, and we can take it from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jakob. That was super interesting. I really enjoyed it. I actually have two quite different questions. I'm just going to ask one, and then we'll see if time allows me to come back to the second one. So I don't know how to choose, but I'm going to go for the harder one, I think. So when you were describing the sort of content of Schopenhauer's kind of political view as you work it out, it seemed to me in one way that it could be thought of as a sort of union or intersection of two different things. So one is some kind of view of politics or political arrangements, which I'm going to leave open for the moment. And then the second is a more specific kind of inflection that one might think of as being driven or motivated by self-interest. I mean, Schopenhauer's own personal self-interest. I mean, that seemed most notable in the case of the various imperatives to protect property and property holders. So my question is kind of two things. So one is, do you think that Schopenhauer himself ever considered that there were these two things going on in his thinking, I mean, whatever it would have been otherwise, and then this more specific sort of self-interest inflection. And the second one is, do you or does anyone ever, is there some example of someone who maybe sort of has a similar view to Schopenhauer's, but without the self-interest? I'm wondering a little bit what would happen if you pulled that thread out. So that's my question.
That's good. So obviously, I do think that there is a social background to his political beliefs. I think that he has a consistent commitment to the protection of property. And if you just look at his commitment to the protection of property, a lot of other seemingly contradictory beliefs become more consistent. So as I said, he doesn't like the aristocracy, not at all, because he thinks that they are sort of playing a state within the state, that they're not really bound to the monopoly of violence, and hence they kind of are an anarchic force in modern society, and they should really, turn that down or become more like everyone else. But then he says, actually, I do like one thing about the aristocracy, and that is that they inherit their titles, because that shows them that they're recognizing property, and property is very important, And then he will make another argument about that it's totally fine to expropriate land in North America, for example, because it's all about establishing property rights. So that's very good. So, it's very hard for me not to read this as driven partly by self-interest, especially when you read his letters where he's very worried about his inheritance and, the interest he gets and so on and so forth. But it's also true that if you read his writings, his view on politics is completely one with his other metaphysical and epistemological ideas, so that it fits so neatly into his overarching architecture of the system, and you could read that and you could know nothing about Schopenhauer's biography. So what do I do with that? I mean, I don't exactly know. I think the self-interest is fairly clear. I also think that he had an amazing ability to put these motivated beliefs into an overarching system. Again, this is what I said with the sociability, right? He has a very elaborate critical philosophy of sociability and why it is empty, damaging, bad, vain, and all those kinds of things. But it's also motivated by his own experiences and his quarrels with his mother. So I guess I would just say, I don't know what to make of it. He just may be extremely good at philosophizing his own personal interests, slotting them into his system. Do you have to understand his social background to understand his philosophy? Probably not, because it stands on its own. Could you have a person who has identical commitments, but not his self-interest? Probably yes. It's not a very good answer. I'm just sort of noticing that it seems to me that a lot of his beliefs are clearly driven by self-interest, but on the other hand, also neatly, nicely packaged with his other beliefs in his great work, The World is Good as a Constitution. But maybe there was a more critical point in that.
I mean, one could. I wasn't particularly meaning to criticize Schopenhauer himself. I mean, you could do that, but you don't have to. I guess one thing I was thinking, just to go to so the overall position he has could be, as you say, divorced from his personal history, and you could try to give it a more sort of general or kind of freestanding rational defense. It seems like the most obvious way to do that, given just what you were describing, would push it in the direction of some form of conservatism. And you were saying it was a different interesting part of his person and position, that he was against that. And so I guess partly what I'm wondering is, if you see the more self-interest or personal thing, you can understand how it's consistent to resist the drive towards conservatism. And but then I thought, well, but if you took that out, if you stipulated we can't do that, and now we're still trying to give a more general justification rather than in relation to his person, how would that work? Where would it go? Because it seems that there are other features of the position that fit with not being conservative. But if you were to kind of generalize those, you'd go in a quite different direction that he didn't want to go either. So that's the opposite. Right.
Well, I do think that he doesn't sound or speak or write like a conservative of his own era. You could see him sort of being a Hobbesian libertarian or some kind, but that's not the discourse of conservatives in his own time. So that's why he wasn't identifiable as a conservative at the time. And so it doesn't belong in that camp. And nor do I feel that, I try to make sense of him by saying that he does respond to certain kinds of suffering that others don't see, suffering that falls outside of what was considered legitimate, large-scale, broadly supported political causes in his time, and so that his distance from these movements allowed him to, catch or perceive things that would have become more salient in our lifetime. But he didn't really put that together.
Yeah, I'll just say one last thing, and I'll shut up. So, because it maybe helps. So that's the element that I was thinking is in a way recognizably distinctive of him and sort of important, but that, at least to a certain prejudice perspective, doesn't fit naturally with normal kind of conservative positions.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And I don't think there was one pot in which all those commitments and opinions came together at the time, which would have made him recognizable as a proponent of, an alternative ideology yet to be formulated. He has these nice things to say about the Society for the Prevention of Animal Cruelty, and then he has these nice things to say about certain kind of non-Western theology, and then he has these other, but it doesn't quite coagulate and come together into a constellation that was recognizable as one position in his time. I don't know if it does even today. But in any case, today he would just seem like a total reactionary. So.
Thank you. We'll just go to one question from Zoom. Also, I've been asked to ask you all to, those of you who are in the room, to identify yourselves when you ask the question. So the series of questions that we just had were from Gopal Srinivasan. But everyone else should just as you speak, please identify yourself. There's a question from Michael Gillespie, Jakob, who asked you to comment on what kind of impact the Romantics had on this thinking. He's thinking particularly of Tierk's view of humans, e.g. William Lovell, he said, and his view on man and politics.
I can't comment on that specifically. I haven't read or understand exactly what he's referring to. His relationship to the Romantics. I find that complicated. There are many studies of this, and obviously there are some affinities. People usually say that he was brought up in a home in which everyone read Voltaire and Enlightenment writing, but that in some sense he studied with Fichte, he studied with Schleiermacher, he was aware of the Romantics, he has a particular interest in art and the amazing kind of redemptive qualities of art that seems vaguely romantic. He has an appreciation for, let's say, a sense of the irrational in life, that the world consists of will, and the will is some striving, endlessly ceaseless hunger for life that isn't kind of penetrable or understandable by reason. It seems sort of vaguely romantic. Obviously, there's a line from Schopenhauer to Nietzsche and Wagner and then on to Freud that seems like a kind of broadly romanticist lane in German intellectual history or something like that. But he doesn't quite sound like the Romantics, like Tieck, who was the one who's referenced, who was a kind of good friend of his mother's. He doesn't quite sound like Novalis and Schlegel. The one overlap which you can really clearly see is that the Romantics are at the forefront of introducing Hindu and Asian thought into the German public sphere. And so Schopenhauer has clearly read the brothers Schlegel and picked up on their work. And a lot of the things that maybe there are overlaps between the Romantics and Schopenhauer that it seems to maybe come from that shared appreciation for another intellectual tradition. But it's hard for me to point to him politically as a romanticist, given that he's so interested in hopes and kind of atomistic understanding of society, whereas the Novalis and Schlegel and all these others wrote about communities of love and brotherhood and genuine reconciliation. It's tough to say that he's a politically romantic.
Thank you. Martin,
Yeah,
identify yourself.
Martin Eisner, Romance Studies, or I guess that's actually I think this is a really fascinating talk, and I wanted to ask you about compassion, and I wanted to ask like what the limits were to what you described as this kind of mystical compassion. And then I felt like you described how Schopenhauer only has limits to his compassion, right? He's a great hater, the misanthrope. And I guess I was thinking about that in terms of some work that you've done before, like thinking about Hannah Arendt mostly, thinking about the problem of compassion and say like Rousseau versus Lessa, right? Like, you know, the problem of having compassion for the perpetrator as well as the victim. So thinking about the problem of sort of evil in the realm, sort of broadly speaking. So I guess that's sort of my question is like, is there a limit to his, I guess I'm coming back to the question that I moved away from, but like, is there a limit to his compassion, or how does he reconcile those two things, kind of like being a great hater and misanthrope and this sort of universal compassion that you described?
Yeah, so this is, you know, the kind of core idea of his moral teachings that, you know, genuinely ethical behavior is always rooted in compassion. And compassion is to feel and understand and truly burden yourself with the suffering of others. And he thinks that that is ultimately, it relies on or is rooted in a kind of understanding that you and I are not really separate beings, that we are in fact the same somehow. And that all the individualization that we see in the world, all the plurality we see in the world, all the separate individuals we see in the world, that is a kind of illusion, the veil of Maya, and that we should, you know, if we could see beyond that, we would recognize that we're all the same. And yes, that would then include perpetrator and victim, right? That would include all. There would be no limit, I guess, to that, right? We would de-differentiate. We would smooth away the individuality of everyone, you know, we wouldn't. So in some sense, the philosophy seems to work like this. The world consists of will, just will, you know, this driving force. But the way we perceive the world, and here he sounds like a Kantian, the way we perceive the world is that we kind of itemize it and individualize it. Things appear to us in space and time as separate entities, as contoured things, and so on and so forth. And that's just like what we kind of, how we process the world. And that's sort of illusory. But when we process the world in that way, when we itemize and individualize and, you know, separate things out, delineate, carve up the world, we come to believe that we are separate, right? And we become sort of practically egoists who only look out for ourselves. So the individualization of the world is in some ways the root of bad moral behavior, where I act as if I had nothing to do with you, right? Just egoistically. But if you could get beyond that illusion, you could grasp the unity of all. Does that make sense? So that compassion is in fact a step towards, in some ways, dissolving the illusion of plurality and understanding our unity. And that dissolution of plurality would include us all, regardless of what we've done. Because the root of me acting poorly towards you and you doing bad things to someone else is that, you know, you're an egoist and you're caught in this world of plurality where you see yourself as separate from others. Does that make sense? It's a detour through his.
I guess I would say no, but not because of what you articulated, but because of, you know, a general philosophical view, perhaps.
But individualization in the realm of representation is somehow the root of a lot of moral problems And if you can step beyond it and grasp our unity in a kind of mystical moment, then you would understand and grasp our unity, and then you wouldn't do bad things to other people. In fact, you wouldn't be other people. There wouldn't be other people at all. Right? That seems to be the philosophical statement.
And can I just ask a follow-up to that? Because it seems, I mean, I'm just wondering about what kind of, you said he sounds almost like a Kantian at one point. What kind of, is there any kind of idea of an as if or simile or any kind of in this movement away from the movement, if you like, that takes us through this Maya to see the unity of all? Is there is there something in that unity that that demands analogy or simile among all these different individuals, or is this will something that is beyond that?
Try to understand your question. It's
so if we sort of think about, you know, the as if you know, an ethical universe that demands some kind of contemplation of an as if, right? If we imagine that someone else will function in the same way as if we all have the same kind of moral values or whatever, then there's some kind of sense of how that relationality among the individuals work. So I'm trying to understand here whether what that kind of relationality is. You said will. I'm trying to understand this. If it's compassion or will, what's the relation then between, say, for example, the human animal and the animal that isn't human, the non-human animal? Is that a relationship of simile? Is it one of analogy, or is it something completely different from that?
Yeah, I don't know if he puts it like that, and I should say I'm not really like haven't focused on all the debates around his morality, but it seems to me that compassion is this kind of beginning step toward a metaphysical clarity about our unity, so to say. So we are here and we're acting mostly as egoists. In fact, we're acting as egoists so much so that the state has to be there to protect ourselves from each other, right? The normal state of the world, Schopenhauer thinks, is a war of all against all, just like in Hobbes. He cites Hobbes, and the state is there to just make sure that anarchy and like general mayhem doesn't happen all the time. But then he says there are some people who feel compassion with others. They notice the suffering of others and they suffer with them. And that seems to him, it seems to me that he's sort of saying that that kind of intense relation where I suffer with you is actually a kind of intense moment of rationality where I start to understand that maybe you and I are not separate after all, right? So compassion is this path towards a metaphysical insight or a mystical insight into our unity that by virtue of our perception will never be immediately clear to us. By virtue of our perception, which clearly distributes us in time and space and so on, and makes us seem contra beings, you know, we act as egoists.
Yeah.
But gripped by the suffering of others, I can come to understand that there's something that ties me to other people, something that truly burdens me about their suffering. Actually, other people and I are not so different. And from that, you then make maybe a leap into a philosophical understanding of the underlying unity.
Right. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, so there's a question here from Edna Kleinhaus, who says, Jakob, how do you think Schopenhauer might transpose his political beliefs to the current political atmosphere? Where do you see points where his politics might be applicable, or where might they conflict with modern democratic systems?
Well, he's not a Democrat. He doesn't believe that normal people should vote or that the great mass of the population should have any say in politics. That's why he is against any kind of revolution. That's why he's against nationalism. That's why he is not impressed by republicanism and is not interested in democratic forms. So he would just be an odd person in today. But as I said, his interest in suffering in many forms seemed to allow him to see the suffering of animals, the suffering of convicts in the prison, the suffering of enslaved people, and so on. People who didn't really count at the time, people who weren't integrated into like a legible, broadly supported cause at the time. And so for his time, he seems fairly, avant-garde to that extent. But that doesn't mean that we would like it. My claim is rather that because he was such a reactionary, because he rejected all these causes that emerged in his own time, he was also more sensitive to causes that were yet to be formulated and hadn't crystallized yet, because he was just sort of interested in forms of suffering and society and a world suffused with suffering. So we like some of his opinions, but we don't like what enabled him to form them, if that makes sense.
There's a question from Paul Jasper, who thanks you for your talk. There's one perhaps rather basic but related question to, I think, Gopal's. Given Schopenhauer's radical individualism but reliance on property, could he have been so naive as not to see these positions as essentially political? Would he have really been surprised at his appropriation by the political right well beyond his death? To ask somewhat a historical question.
No, I don't think he was naive at all. I think, he, as I said in the talk, he felt that, the property of some was always going to be at risk, given the unequal distribution of means in society, and that it was the state's task to protect property owners and the wrongs against them. And there was an explicit idea he had, and that coincided, I'm sure, with right-wing people at the time, and he would have recognized it, and I think he would have recognized it today too. It's just, again, he has that political commitment, but also this idea of a compassion which would de-individualize us all, And so it's just a kind of strange conflict between his radical moral claims about a understanding of our unity and his minimalist, right-wing, if you want, political claims, which all have to do with holding on tight to what you have and not letting it be at risk or vulnerable to. It's kind of maximal contradiction between politics and morality, it seems like.
Yes. Julianne Werlin, English. In the course of this conversation, I was wondering, I know this is kind of an annoying question, does so-and-so have an influence, but what about the tradition of English political economy? I'm just thinking, because of Smith's emphasis on sympathy, basically, yes. Is there something parallel happening with Smith's, on the one hand, the individuation of property, on the other hand, sympathy is the sort of primary moral sentiment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very good question. Why does he go back to Hobbes? I heard this question before, though. Why does he go back to Hobbes? Doesn't he read everything that came after Hobbes, like Adam Smith and so on and so forth? Why doesn't he have access to that? Why doesn't he develop discourses that sound like that? And I don't know why. It's like, again, kind of willful anachronism. He's read Hobbes, since he's going back to that. I think there are, listen, you would have to, so I do think that there's a kind of parallel, that there's on the one hand, so he believes that, there is a market and there's commerce. He was intimately connected with it. He was practiced, he was supposed to have a career in it, and he appreciates it. He appreciates how merchants operate and how they have to protect their reputations and how they trade and how they must be protected and so on. So there's a kind of small version of that, like an appreciation of markets and their dynamism and how they generate prosperity. And then in this kind of talk about compassion and so on, something like maybe sympathy or something like that, but it takes in another direction, and the two are not really put together, or so you could see that, like, if he had been more aware of the English tradition, maybe it would have looked different. Maybe it would have been more articulated, mediated, put together. That's all I kind of have to say. It seems like in Schopenhauer you have. So here's the thing with Schopenhauer. What you have in Schopenhauer is a kind of bourgeois thinker in Germany. All the other people, Kant, Fichte, Hegel, they come from very different traditions. They were trained not by merchants, didn't come up weren't socialized in merchant families or something like that, but they were usually the son of clergy or the son of civil servants, and they had a kind of attachment to the state, and they had long careers, first as teachers and then as university professors and so on and so forth, and they developed this discourse, and he's outside of that, and he's opened up to the English public sphere and the English tradition. And yet there are these lacunas. I can't quite, make sense of them. But it seems like he is in some sense methodologically an individualist. He has or committed to methodological individualism. He has some kind of vague appreciation for markets. He has a discourse of sympathy and compassion, but it doesn't quite gel together. And it's not really inspired by decades or centuries afterwards. Does that make sense? It's just like a.
Oh yeah, I mean, it just suggests if Smith also makes sympathy kind of the moral underpinning of an individualist market, bourgeois philosophy, it suggests that these things, even if they seem superficially irreconcilable, are not.
Yeah, they might not be. Yeah, it's just that there's separate islands somehow, and they seem so strangely incompatible in his work, right? But again, if he had read Smith, maybe he would have found ways to negotiate and mediate and put it all together. Now it seems that politics is this one sphere with one set of rules where you have to kind of freeze the war of all against all. And then there's the moral opportunity to feel compassion and to like embrace and the de-individuation in our unity. And then there's like nothing in between.
I mean, I was actually going to ask something about that too, because it does. I mean, it says something also about his idea of the status of the philosophical, right? In particular, in relation to the moral or moral philosophy, I suppose. But I mean, I'm curious about whether that's actually articulated in itself. I mean, I think Hobbes. I'm looking to you because it's your period, actually. I think Hobbes says something like, leisure is the mother of philosophy, isn't that right? I think that that's right. And it seems as if there is a kind of that the idea that these are completely separate planes of thought seems also to be motivating this, right?
Yeah, just that, it's he actually thought that philosophy should not be taught at universities. He thought you should be basic courses in logic. That's it. Because as soon as you started speaking about something else, there would be so many pressures to perform. Their ministers would appoint philosophy professors. There would be coteries and mediocrities at the university. There was the publishing press industry. So there was many filters and pressures to perform. He had absolutely no confidence in the university's ability to produce any genuinely interesting philosophical thought. You could only do it from a position of independence. That independence was given to him because of his father's inheritance, earned on the market, and with an understanding that you don't want to be dependent, subordinate to government and so on. So I do want to make a kind of comment about politics and more, because this is partly what my book is about. And that is, as I said, he doesn't think so. The basic problem of Schopenhauer's philosophy is that the world is will. The world is just an endlessly willing, striving force that never comes to a destination, doesn't have a telos or a goal, never satisfy just an endless striving, right? And then we have our perception, which individualizes items and creates a world of plurality and makes us believe that we are, all striving against one another. That's what happens when you put this grid of representation on top of will, right? And then he thinks there are two solutions, the political and the moral to some extent. The moral one is to kind of move beyond the grid of individualization and grasp our unity, right? That's the philosophically, mystically higher realization, right? Where we do away with the problem of this endless strife of individualized units. But that moral compassion is simply not available to anyone. It's a kind of, it requires a moral genius where you see and feel the suffering of others. Politics is in some ways not in anywhere close to some kind of realization of unity. It just uses concentrated force to keep everyone in place. Okay? You just say, okay, everyone is striving, everyone is colliding, we'll just use monopoly of violence to keep everyone from cutting the throat of everyone else. So in some sense, politics is, so there's a pathological condition at the heart of the world. That's the war of all against all that results from the individualization of the will. I hope everyone is with me. The morality, truly understood, is to do away with the problem by doing away with individualization. Politics is in some ways to freeze the pathology and to say, we will only deal with the symptoms of the war of all against all. We'll only keep everyone in check, but we have no greater understanding of what drives it, and we have no cure for it. We have no way of getting beyond egoism and individualism and individualization, and we have no true grasp of what's truly driving everyone. And that's why I think you see this kind of radical divide between morality and politics, where morality is like actually solution to the pathology of the world, whereas politics is just like symptom management that never can get anywhere but holding everything still, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. I've got one from here and then I'll come to you. There's a question from Sarah Porcio. Thank you, Jakob. I was interested in the link you drew between Schopenhauer's critique of sociability and attitude towards his mother. Do you think sociability per se as a mode is gendered feminine for Schopenhauer? And if so, are other related categories like mediocrity, chatter, a la Kierkegaard, etc., gendered feminine as well? Does he have an alternative notion of community interaction that he thinks is better? Or should proper male minds just withdraw into their properties and think thoughts?
Yes, that's basically, I mean, I wouldn't say he is very good at writing, invectives and throwing them at people. And he is absolutely scathing about Fichte and Hegel and Schelling and all the philosophers of his own time. So it's not as if he only attacks women, but it's true that he is a horrible misogynist and that his mother was a very illustrious organizer of social events and also a illustrious famous writer, and that for him sociability was in some ways coded as feminine. It was during the time she hosted these events, and she was an absolutely masterful organizer of conversations. It's all in the letters between Goethe and other luminaries in Weimar, how she invited people, how she knew how to enliven conversations, how to facilitate them, how to manage them, and so on. And so chatter and sociability is absolutely coded as feminine. And that's just the beginning of his misogynist diatribe. So there's so much more. So I think that's true. And yes, in some sense, he thinks, does he have a different idea of community? No, I would say he doesn't. He does actually kind of think that we should all withdraw to our property and think thoughts. But here's the thing: the interest, if you think about what I said about politics and morality, in some sense, neither of these fields allow one individual to truly see another individual. Because in politics, you're kind of completely focused on your self-interest and you're battling everyone else for advantage, and everyone else is just like a horrible obstacle, okay, that you will annihilate. right? In some sense, in politics, in the political realm, you're not taking into account that there are other people. Morality, you're sort of the whole point of morality is to get beyond the separation between us. So in that sense, you want to do away with individuation, right? So again, you don't really see other people. But when he speaks about sociability, and he does it extremely critically, but when he talks about sociability, he nonetheless talks about how there are dissonances between different people, how there can be disharmony or actually kind of harmony, how people come together as if in a choir, people come together as if in an orchestra. There's some kind of interaction and temperamental attunement that he speaks about it all kind of negatively. But I argue in the book that sociability, despite everything negative he says about it, is the one place where he kind of speaks about social relationality without having an idea of either do away with all individuation, morality, or keep every egoist in check, politics. So I think that there's a moment, that's why I have a chapter on sociability, is that I think it's the one moment we actually start thinking about how human communities work, and how people interact, even though it's negatively coded.
Where does his sister fit into this gendered story?
So his sister is, with their mother in Weimar, participates in the salon, and there's a wonderful article about the kind of art that she practiced, paper cuts and things like that. And she was in some ways part of a younger generation in that Weimar era, and also someone who could take over the mother's sociability and kind of continue it and so on. And he has a longer relationship with his sister. They have a more intimate and relationship of trust and so on. So she's absolutely part of the picture, and he has some respect for her and some love for her. So I don't think that as I said, I don't think he theoretically dismisses the entire realm of sociability. It actually forces him to think about how humans interact, rather than simply doing away with all of humanity in its individualization, or forcing it to stay put.
Yeah, I majored at undergraduate, and I'm just curious about you just mentioned the dualistic relation between politics and ethical theory of Schopenhauer, and from my interpretation, Schopenhauer's political theories is based on probably his interpretation of Hobbes' concept of self-interest, and it seems to me more rational rather than a lineage of his thought on the world as a representation of the globe. But for his ethical theory, I think he based more on, probably you just mentioned the German Romanticism, part of Hegel's philosophy between me and other, this dialectical relations. But so one of my questions is how Schopenhauer's view of politics was different from that of Hobbes, and how his ethical theory was kind of come from Kant or from Hegel's theory, and how this kind of related to the history of philosophy in general.
Yeah, it's a nice way of putting it that, in some sense, I said that politics and morality represent for Schopenhauer two radically disparate ways of dealing with what he considers a kind of fundamental pathology of the world. But you can also say, sort of intellectual historically, you can say they represent his integration of two traditions, right? So when he speaks about politics, he turns to Hobbes, and when he speaks about morality, I wouldn't say he takes over what Kant says, but it's basically a big quarrel with Kant, right? His moral theory is presented as all the flaws with Kant and his alternative to Kant. So it's working through Kant, you could say. And you could say, yeah, so he integrates, morality and politics into his work, and they come from two different streams, so to speak, and it's all sort of fitted into his. So that's a very nice way of putting it. Is he to what extent is he Hobbes? Yeah, I mean he was read Hobbes. he likes to quote Hobbes a lot. I don't know if he's a very deep interpreter of Hobbes or anything like that, but he cites Hobbes as a kind of authority. So when he says, the world is in kind of a perpetual state of civil war, he can turn to Hobbes as an authority and says, as Hobbes already said, he likes to kind of almost outsource his political thinking to Hobbes and just kind of pull in Hobbes and say, well, here it all already is. But I just kind of espouse this, problem solved, and I don't have to speak about this anymore. Right? That's why people say he's just derivative. He doesn't say anything new about politics. If he says about something in politics, he just relies on Hobbes. But as I try to explain, not so much in the paper, but in this question and answer session, is that he provides Hobbes with a radically different environment. Because I don't think that Hobbes speaks about the unity underlying a plurality or the world as will and the world as representation. So he's taking Hobbes, but he's putting it in an entirely new philosophical context and kind of explains why it is that there's a war of all against all, and why it is that we need a sovereign to manage it and so on and so forth. So sort of Hobbes, but in a completely different landscape. That's one of his talents, Schopenhauer's talents, is to take things and slot them into his system and give them like a radically new context in which they seem like similar, and yet they now are attached to another architecture and do another kind of job.
So do you think, is there a kind of like an irrational element that inserted into Hobbes' philosophy, like Schopenhauer turned it into its own?
Yeah, I think that basically, he says, when you're faced with a war of all against all these self-interested individuals understand that, yes, they can make gains by attacking others, but they're likely to lose more by being attacked by others. So enlightened self-interest, will drive them to contract with other people, to transfer power to one sovereign and so on. He believes that politics is basically a system that people are able to set up because they're rational and self-interested, right? The problem is, though, that that's not going to help you understand, the unity of the world underneath everything. For that, you need spontaneous compassion with others, right? That's more of a path towards. So you could say that, sure, reason is guiding political action, guiding political cooperation. The state is actually, what he says, a masterpiece of human rationality and human egoism. It's a construct that we put together out, in rational understanding of our own situations, the self-interested and conflicting individuals, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't solve the pathology of the world. It doesn't get you beyond, the war of all against all. It just freezes the war of all against all. It just cages it. So he lauds reason and says it's great, but it doesn't get you towards a state of metaphysical clarity. That's why I'm sort of saying that politics is indispensable, it's necessary, and yet very limited, because it doesn't actually bring you to a philosophical insight about the fundamental pathology of the world, which is what he's interested in.
Michael Gillespie actually has a comment on a similar sort of thing. So let me just sort of read it, because I think that it also speaks to this conversation. Then we'll go to you, Gilmar. He says, Schopenhauer says that all life exists by consuming other life, and as a result, we're all criminals and all victims. And that compassion is just recognizing, I'm interested in this idea of recognition here, but it's just recognizing our mutual and inevitable suffering. Isn't the inevitable politics that follows from this a kind of Hobbesianism? So, I think
That's a great summary, yeah.
Gilmar.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask a follow-up on Martin's question about the limit of compassion. And it seems to me, and my question in the end is going to be, is this right? That on your account of Schopenhauer's discussion of compassion, compassion is actually only superficially an overcoming of egoism. Properly understood, compassion is actually the triumph, the metaphysically clear side of triumph.
It is, yes. Thank you so much. You kind of a step ahead of us. In some sense, compassion, yes, it breaks down a certain kind of level of individuality that we are aware of here with our minds who perceive the world in a certain way. So But if we merge, right? If we all become one, if we all merge in this will, that striving and so on, have we really achieved anything? I mean, we're now one, but are we less will? We're now one, but are we less self-interested in some ways? No, we've just created some kind of superorganism, and compassion has brought us together. So that's why in Schopenhauer's thought, I think there is one further step, and that is to deny the will altogether. And that I think is the kind of highest level of sacredness, is to turn against the will and to truly still it, because then then you're dealing truly with the pathology, which is. But that's not available. That's not an option that is available for a lot of people. That for him is manifest in holy figures and not many more. But you're right in thinking that compassion for him is not the final step. It is a higher level of genuine sacredness where you try to dissolve the will itself. Does that make sense? Yeah. And that is what he gets from, what he thinks he gets from Buddhist teachings.
Thank you so much. Well, look, we are at time now. It is 11 o'clock, and I want to thank everyone for coming in person. Thank the 22 people we had on Zoom for coming as well, and just join me in congratulating Jakob on a really interesting, stimulating
Oh, thank you. That's great.
presentation and question answer session.